much, Count Corla, and I think it's absolutely incredible in some ways that we're dealing with a situation where our coronial service is operating under legislation from the 1960s and all of the massive changes that have taken place in Irish society since that time, and yet we haven't been able to get our acts together in order to change and update and modernise that. I'm aware that secondary legislation, obviously behind the scenes, did change, but having had the privilege of attending one of the conferences of our coroners 2 years ago, I know the good work that they do. I know how under-resourced they are. I know how they've striven might and main actually to demand of this House that legislation should be changed to allow them to do a job that they could do in the public good. And I think in that sense it's absolutely tremendous, in some ways shocking in many, that we're dealing against that backdrop, but at least we're here now with the first piece of legislation finally, and hopefully that's going to be seen through to update them somewhat. I'm not going to go hugely into the details of the legislation. I think the Minister has done that. Other speakers have done that as well. But it does arm the coroners more. It does give them more powers, and that is to be absolutely welcomed. I will reiterate also the points made by the Minister, that we have been in discussions about the amendments that unfortunately didn't make it into the original draft of the bill, but the commitment by the Minister's office and the Department to ensure that when we get to committee stage, some important amendments will be included in that. And I can assure the people in the gallery that we have gone over that with a fine-tooth comb, and we are by and large very happy with the amendments which will be put in at the latter stages. And in that sense, I would like to thank Brendan and Madeleine in particular. This House is very good at criticising, particularly the Department of Justice, which comes in for a justifiable kicking a lot of the time, but it's also very important to recognise the good work done, and I know certainly any delays in this area weren't as a result of the staff at the coalface. And I'd probably say as well that they weren't as a result of the ministers either, because this minister has said it's a priority for him, but I know it most definitely was a priority for Minister Frances Fitzgerald as well, who elevated this as a key project item of her department. But what does that say about the society that we're in, that not one but two ministers prioritise this important area, and yet it has taken an almighty uphill battle to get us where we are today, to get a recognition which actually wasn't there in 2015 when we moved the legislation, despite the fact that the government at the time largely welcomed that bill. They did have reservations about a lot of the clauses in terms of mandatory inquests in cases of maternal deaths, which are now being incorporated in this bill. And that's great in one level, but it's a tragedy that it's taken that long to get us here, and we have to be honest about it. The only reason it is here has been because of the actual heroic struggle led by the people in the gallery in support of the victims of our lack of mandatory inquests, the people who've been at the coalface, whose human tragedies actually they've turned into a movement to try and change the law for the betterment of others. It's quite incredible to meet the families of the women who died in our maternity hospitals. People who in many cases, and I'll be mentioning them all later, but people like Sean Rowlett, to lose your partner in childbirth, to come home to 3 children and a new baby, to run a farm, when you probably never did a household thing in your life before, and have to deal with all that, and not just deal with that, but raise your children on your own and still have the courage and the decent humanity and empathy to turn your grief into something constructive so that no other family would have to do that. And that's what people like the partners of many of the women who died, the midwives and the foot soldiers in the Elephant Collective have done to get us here, because I've no doubt, and they shouldn't have any doubt either, that this wouldn't have happened without their efforts. And that's, you know, it's a recognition of them, but you know what as well, it's an absolutely shocking indictment of our system, because we have a problem with women in this country. The problem isn't the women, but we have a problem with the health care given to women in this country before, during and after they give birth. Our health system has infected them with hepatitis C, taken hacksaws to their pelvises, removed their wombs unnecessarily, refused them in abortions in the most unspeakable circumstances, dismissed their pain in the recent vaginal mesh scandal, that it was in their minds. They go to doctors and they report these appalling pain and problems, and not a single doctor reports the problem to the HPRA, but yet it continues to prescribe vaginal mesh to women, refusing them treatment, treating them as incubators in circumstances even as their families beg the state to let them go, threatened to imprison them if they didn't want to undergo unwanted C-sections, insulted them, ignored them when they tried to speak up, left them traumatised and reeling. And after all that has been done, the state inevitably gears up for another go at them, dragging them and their families through the courts. That's the backdrop to this. And the reason why it's so shocking is the difference in relation to maternal deaths is this is women interfacing our hospitals, healthy women who should have and had a justified expectation that her experiences in the hospital wouldn't leave her scarred either psychologically or physically. Women with a justified expectation that their death in a hospital would be almost unimaginable, and a justified expectation that should actually something go wrong, that she and her family will be dealt with honestly, openly, respectfully and transparently. But actually, how often does that expectation get lived up to? And it doesn't give me any, comfort to say, I'd have to say, rarely. It took the Hep C victims years. The symphysiotomy victims are still fighting of it into their latter years of life. We know women who've walked into our maternity hospitals and walked out days later with PTSD. Thousands of women, according to the charity Nurture, who experience postnatal, post-traumatic stress every year. Now, we're told that the Coombe and Holles Street aren't war zones, although I'd say some of the midwives in the gallery would probably disagree with that and say that they actually are, to many intents and purposes. But if they're not war zones, what are the causes of post-traumatic stress when pregnant women go into our hospitals? And one of the mechanisms identified, or one of the problems on the list, is impersonal treatment or problems with hospital staff, not being listened to, lack of information or explanation are 3 of the 15 circumstances. And dismissing, ignoring or denying information to patients has real lifelong consequences for them. It's not a minor thing. It's actually a frightening mark of the paternalism that still infests our maternity services, that we're still so far behind the curve on being honest with women about what's happening to them and why it's happening to them. We know of the families whose healthy babies ended up with catastrophic birth injuries leading to lifelong disabilities, families who fight for a decade and more to get their resources for their children, maybe take 10, 15 years before finally the HSE coughs up. We know elsewhere, in a sample of 30 baby deaths due to negligence in Irish hospitals between 2008 and 2016, that in every single case where there's a record of an apology or a settlement, it was received 3 to 9 years after the baby died, and in many cases with no admission of liability. Now, why is this abject cruelty put on innocent people? Why is it happening? Because, we could look back at this, but part of this discussion should be about looking forward. What is it about? Is it to keep the insurance companies happy, to keep premiums down? Is that it? Is it just institutional inertia? Is that the reason? Is that why our hospitals treat people to what is in some ways arbitrary torture? Because all of the international evidence points to the fact that if doctors and healthcare staff are open and honest with patients when something goes wrong, then those patients are much less likely to sue. All of the international evidence suggests that many of those people who do sue do so to get answers, not to get redress. And I'm making the point because it's very relevant in the case of inquests and getting information, and it has to be said. A year to the day myself and Mick Wallace sat down with senior officials from the HSE to talk about mandatory open disclosure. They were totally against it. The only reason why we even got a meeting with them was because we'd unexpectedly got a few amendments through in the Civil Liability Bill calling for mandatory open disclosure, and suddenly they all wanted to meet us to get us to reverse that and to tell us it was such a bad idea without any supporting information. Now, of course, on the back of the cervical crisis cancer, mandatory open disclosure is the order of the day. Everybody wants it now, including the ones who voted it down last year when we had the chance. What a sad indictment for the people who've been the victims and who could have got answers in the last 18 months if we had put the legislation in at that stage. So tonight's bill is actually very much a piece with the push for open disclosure, because we need a health system that works for women and their families, that doesn't compound the suffering by denying, defending, covering up in the face of tragedy. That's why we need mandatory inquests. That's why we need mandatory open disclosure. We need pre-action protocols to get the lawyers out of our hospitals. That's not news. A recent editorial in the Irish Medical Journal made the point that in many hospitals the medical risk management department is in larger and better staffed than the library. There's something deeply wrong with a system that spends more on damages and legal fees than it does on funding our maternity services, and this bill really should be part of a suite of measures that addresses that. We talk about a litigious culture in this state. Is it any wonder when people aren't getting any answers that they're forced to go to the law? And we do see this bill as a start. It's been a long road getting there, but it should be a start. Now, just my own involvement on the issue of maternal deaths did begin more than 7 years ago, in May 2011, when I was contacted by AIMS Ireland to seek help in raising parliamentary questions as to why there hadn't been a full inquiry into the tragic death of Bimbo Ononugwa in the Rotunda in March 2010. And from the first questions that we put down in relation to that case, we've stayed in touch with the warriors in the gallery. We did what we could to support them to gain an inquest for Bimbo, and finally, on the 12th of December 2012, the coroner agreed to hold an inquest. In November 2013, after 4 long days of hearings spread over 8 months, he recorded a verdict of medical misadventure in Bimbo's death, and I did attend that inquest, which was shocking and devastating actually in equal measure. But what was even more shocking is the fact that before her inquest took place, in the autumn of 2012, 6 women lost their lives in our maternity services, with inquests in only 2 of them. In the autumn of 2014, there were 3 further inquests, all with verdicts of medical misadventure. And the onus was on all of us to do everything that we possibly could to prevent more tragedies and to step up the fight in honour of the women who died and indeed their families. So we did introduce the bill in 2015 and it's been a long road since then, let's be honest about it. From 2007 to 2014, the families of Tanya McCabe, Evelyn Flanagan, Jennifer Crean, Bimbo Ononugwa, Dara Kivlahan, Nora Hyland, Savita Halapanavar, Sally Rolette, not satisfied with the very partial explanations offered to them by the HSE, had to fight tooth and nail for inquest. They needed to know why healthy women who came early and appropriately for antenatal care, who were fully in the care of our system, died, for all of the reasons pointed out by Fiona earlier, in order to learn the lessons to prevent it happening to other women. That's the step that we have to get to today. We have 2 or 3 maternal deaths in all categories in Ireland every year. We need to know in full what's happened, what lies behind the deaths. We can't rely on confidential inquiries, on internal inquiries and all the rest of it, because hospitals and the HSE hide behind them and hide the truth. That's a fact. We know it, and it is timely and relevant, I think, that we're having this discussion on the back of the earlier discussion with the Scally report. And that's why we need public inquests for the families involved in these terrible tragedies in order to enforce genuine accountability for the terrible failures that are there in the known cases, but not just the known cases, all the cases where there should have been an inquest but there wasn't. And the pain doesn't go away for people. Only last week I happened to meet a Polish man who's lived in Ireland for many years, whose wife died in childbirth in 2011. That man's family and his story and his name hasn't appeared in any statistic or any book, and I'm not going to do that here tonight either by doing that. But I will say that the pain of that man 7 years on is just as fresh as it was on that day. He still hasn't had the answers during the traumatised birth of a child that, because of what happened, the child was also damaged in the birth. He's been raising that child alone for the past 7 years, and he's never had an answer since the time he was sedated in the chamber as he begged the staff to save her life, only for it to be too late. So there are cases out there where people never got the answers, and I do want to mention the partners of the women who championed this issue and to put it on the record, but I do so very much in the spirit that there are names of women, their partners, their families and their children who haven't made it onto the Dáil record, who never got an answer. And I mention the names of those we do know, out of respect also for those that we don't know. So for Sean Rowlett, Michael Kivlahan, Abiola Adesina, Aidan McCabe, Stephen Hyland, Francis Crean, Padraig Flanagan, Praveen Halaparnavar and Alec Tawley. Because let's be clear, since we moved this legislation the first time, Alec Tawley sadly died also. An unnecessary death, a death that had to be dragged out through litigation by her partner, Alan, and it happens all over again. And the reason why people sacrificed their time and their energies, who laid bare their most personal tragedies, was in order to ensure that it wouldn't happen again. And that's why we're here. So, look, I just want to say, I suppose, the tribute for the night, people thank me. There's no need to thank me, and it's not me anyway. I'm an office. I'm a brand. The brains behind my office are the ones who did work, namely Aideen O'Sullivan, who's in the gallery, but also Liz Casson and Rona McCord in my office, who do liaise and regularly fight this battle and liaise with all of the people that we've had the honour to campaign with. So there's no need to thank us. That's our job. But for the people in the Elephant Collective, these people have been absolutely tireless campaigners in the run-up to this bill. Let's look at what they did. They travelled the country with their Picking Up the Pieces exhibition. They've written letters, postcards, press statements. They've talked to local councils. We've the privilege of knowing that many, many local councils, the length and breadth of this country, with members of all parties and none, have all supported their call for mandatory inquests in cases of maternal deaths. They are the most amazing group of people who've ever got together, as far as I'm concerned, and their work on this campaign, their doggedness, their tirelessness and their kindness has just been incredible. It's actually a lesson to the type of approach that we should have in our health service, that caring, collective empathy, a human understanding. Everybody makes mistakes. The best health service in the world is going to make mistakes. There are going to be women who go into hospital healthy and happy who are going to die in childbirth this year. Sadly, that's a fact of life, but we can minimise those cases if we learn the lessons, and mandatory inquest is part of that. And to that end, it will be, and this legislation will be, a testament to Jo Murphy-Lawless, who's retiring tomorrow. That's why she's making me cry. From a lifelong service to women, pregnant women in particular, to student midwives. Trinity College have been so lucky to have the brains and the passion and the commitment of this tiny woman who's an absolute giant. And I think the fact that she's retiring from this active phase of her life with Trinity and going on to bigger and better things is an incredibly fitting testament to her that we're here tonight, and I think we owe it to her to ensure that we try and get it through all stages and enacted before Christmas.